Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Gretchen Schuler, and I'm the past president of the Historical Society, or the acting president, maybe, at the moment. This evening's program is co-sponsored by the Wayland Free Public Library, by the Wayland Human Rights, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, and by the Wayland Museum and Historical Society. But first things first, are we hearing this or not? I'm sorry.
Is it on?
Okay.
Yes. Okay.
First things first,
There we go.
thanks so much to Courtney Michael, who is a reference and program librarian here in Wayland and who does all the organizing and the Zooming and gets us all in the right place, while the rest of us that are sponsoring this enjoy the fruits of her labors. So thank you, Courtney. Some housekeeping before we start. We are recording this session for broadcast on Waycam, our local cable access channel, and for the library's YouTube page. So you'll be able to watch and share it with friends. The Historical Society will also have the link on our website. Our speaker this evening, Jane Sciacca, will present for about 40-45 minutes, I'm not really sure, and then we'll have time for questions. So for those of you who are joining us via Zoom, feel free to put your questions in the chat at any time, and Courtney will share them aloud during the Q&A. So since I have the microphone, I will take this opportunity to note that our local historical society, located just across the rail trail in the Grout Herd House, operates and depends on our memberships and donations toward preserving our local history. So we'd love you to join if you're not already a member. And also stop in to visit and learn about volunteer opportunities. Kay's great at finding just the right project for you. Opportunities and some aspects of Wayland history that particularly resonate with you. So on to our speaker this evening, Jane Sciacca. Jane is well known in Wayland and beyond for her distinct ability to enliven historical events and places for all to understand and enjoy. She has provided innumerable programs for the Wayland Historical Society and the National Park Service, where she worked as an interpretive National Park Ranger for nearly 20 years and specialized in slavery and abolition. Jane's research skills are impeccable. Members of the Wayland Historical Society have benefited from her expertise as the Society's president for 8 years, curator for 2, and lecturer on Lydia Maria Child, women's suffrage, and many other topics. So tonight, in her talk titled Researching Enslavement in Colonial Sudbury, Jane will help us to understand how one approaches such a challenging topic that has been hidden and untold for centuries. I'm honored to introduce Jane.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Gretchen. I have so many people to thank here. The Wayland Historical Society, my home for 40, almost 50 years now. One of the beautiful parts about doing this project is getting to meet people. And some of the people I met actually live across the river because this was one town back when I'm the period that I'm studying. So I have also gotten to know Rachel Robinson, the director of the Sudbury History Center or Historical Society. And I have gotten to know Doug Curry, who has really been a huge help to me, who is a member of not just the Sudbury Historical Society, but also the Wayland Historical Society. So I've just been blessed, but I also have to give a lot of credit to MJ Wright, who couldn't be here tonight because she is the one who ropes me into all these projects initially with the exhibit that is, I think, spending its last few days up, but has been up for a couple of months on slavery. So MJ has been, and then Courtney, who is here, and she is my technical guru. So anything that looks good, I didn't do. So, but Courtney did. So thank you so much. Also in addition to having friends here, I have my husband is here, and he has had a lot to do with this book. He has been my editor, proofreader, so many times he probably could memorize the whole thing. But anyway, thank you so much, all of you. This presentation is a preview of a book that I am readying for publication on enslavement in Colonial Sudbury, which is modern Wayland and Sudbury. Most of the stories in the book have been told before and have never been told before. That's a big mistake. And are the result of over 20 years of research into slavery and abolition in Massachusetts. Before I started working in Concord almost 40 years ago as a docent at the Old Manse, I was totally unaware that enslaved persons had lived in the northern states, except for some who had escaped from the South. For me, the most stirring book I have ever read on the subject is The Negro in Colonial New England by Lorenzo Green. This was written in 1942 by a Black professor. And it is a wonderful introduction to the treatment of African Americans in colonial times. I picked up a copy at the Northbridge Visitor Center at Minuteman National Historical Park over 30 years ago when it was reprinted by a vanity press because he did not get the attention that he deserved back in the day. And it has been part of my life ever since. It is now available online through several websites, so that's wonderful. I spent most of my working life in Concord in historic houses lived in by the pioneers of American literature. Nathaniel Hawthorne and Ralph Waldo Emerson at the Old Manse, Louisa May Alcott and her family at Orchard House and at the Wayside in Minuteman National Historical Park, a house that the Alcotts called Hillside, and even branched out to Cambridge, where I worked at the home of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Each of these homes had connections to enslavement in colonial times and or of abolition in the 19th century, stories that were largely unknown and untold when I first started interpreting them. My first revelation as to the existence of slavery in colonial Concord came from Bob Gross's The Minutemen and Their World, first published in 1976. I was shocked that some of the men who stood up for their rights as Englishmen at Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775, were owners of enslaved people. Having learned that there had been enslaved people in Concord at the start of the American Revolution, I naturally wondered whether there had been any in Sudbury in colonial times. Of course, I was quite confident that I would find none, not alone enough to make into a book. By Sudbury, I mean modern day Wayland and Sudbury, divided in 1780, just as enslavement in Massachusetts was drawing to a close, and it broke into Sudbury and East Sudbury, which was renamed Wayland in 1835. My research fittingly includes both of these modern towns. Vital records present particular challenges as an enslaved person might be found in Sudbury or Wayland vital records, even if it is known that they had lived in colonial times on the Wayland side. So that always a town divided from colonial times always poses a little extra special challenge to researchers. One of the main obstacles to a study of enslaved persons in colonial Massachusetts is that the Puritans, with few exceptions, referred to all who served them, whether enslaved, free, white, or indigenous, as servants. Two exceptions are the 1754 Massachusetts slave census, which used the word slave, and the Massachusetts tax valuation list in 1771, which taxed people for servants for life, the preferred euphemism for those who were enslaved. They didn't like the word slave. Both were conducted while Massachusetts was under British rule, without very specific documentation, often using multiple resources. It is difficult to identify any Black persons in colonial Massachusetts as enslaved. Many Blacks fall into a gray area, probably enslaved, but without documented proof. Nevertheless, you'll be happy to know. I don't think that's an appropriate word for a talk on slavery, but whatever the appropriate word is, there are definite indicators to identify many persons who were enslaved. That, of course, is what you learn from years of trial and error doing research on those who were enslaved and those who enslaved them. In Reverend Israel Loring's copious journals, and he is one of the people that I spend most time with, as his ministry in Sudbury spans 66 years, for example, you have maidservant Hannah, which you see in this excerpt from his journals, mentioned a euphemism for enslaved. Later, she is referred to as Hannah, his hired maid servant. A subtle difference, but then one that indicates that Hannah was no longer enslaved. She now receives some sort of compensation that an enslaved woman would not get, although she continued to serve in the same household. Every town has different, resources uniquely available to it before looking beyond one's borders. And I feel I hit the jackpot when it came to Colonial Sudbury. So it's very variable what you can find in any particular community. By the early 2000s, the town of Sudbury had digitized many documents and put them online, including town meeting records and the more personal accounts found in Reverend Loring's journals and the diary of Jerusha Howe, associated with the Wayside Inn, which provided insight into the lives of the enslaved and their enslavers. And there is the Sudbury Archives. You just plug in what you're interested in looking at, and it will magically take you there. You can also find on the Sudbury Archives website several property deeds, for that is what the bills of sale for enslaved persons were called. And Nero Benson's Emancipation paper, which I just saw last week, and you can see this was the highlight of my day. It is in the town clerk's office in Sudbury, and it really was a thrill to see it, because on the Sudbury Archives there's only a transcription of it. So in the case of transcriptions, they're good. But they're not the originals. So if you have any question of whether you're looking, you want, at least if you see a scan, you know you are scanning the original, but a transcription can have errors. In fact, we found a very minor error in the transcription. They had a 6 and it should have been an ampersand. So just little silly things like that but these things happen. So if you can always go to the original, that's what you really want to do. So the Sudbury archives are still available online and in expanded form. I remember trudging to the Martha Mary Chapel in Sudbury to go to the Wayside Inn archives in knee-deep snow over 20 years ago, before New England became a semi-tropical paradise, to see documents pertaining to Ezekiel House, enslaved man, Portsmouth. You can access them online, now on the Sudbury Archives website, no matter what the weather, or even during a pandemic, which was really a lifesaver. And the people that I contacted, they were archivists and mass archives or wherever at newspapers. They like, oh yes, tell us what to find and we'll send it to you. And they all did, because I think they were looking for some entertainment themselves. And while New England ministers were often slaveholders, Colonial Sudbury, as I mentioned before, was blessed with Israel Loring, who served the community for 66 years from 1706 until his death in 1772. Until a second precinct was created in 1724, Reverend Loring served the whole town, and actually the meeting houses where he preached were on the east side of the river. But even better, he kept, and then after that, he decided to go to the west side. And so most of his journals after 1724 are very west side centered. And I also should mention, in case people don't know, that when the town broke, when the two towns split, all the legal documents went to the Sudbury side, because the Wayland side, the east side, wanted to leave them. And therefore they got the name and they got the documents. And so that presented issues. When I first started out, that presented a lot of issues, but now I think things are much better. But even better, Reverend Loring kept journals for much of the time filled with references to his own enslaved persons, and those mainly of his West Side parishioners. Those journals were and still are online at the Sudbury Archives, and I have spent considerable time reading and rereading them. Where else but in a journal or the rare letter are you likely to hear about the sad accident that befell Josiah Brown's manservant, who intentionally shot himself with a gun in 1729. It is sometimes necessary to look beyond Sudbury for sources of information. As much as we think that all people were born and died in the same place 300 years ago, lots of people moved from one town to another or owned land in different places. Enslaved persons could be sold from one town to another. 2-year-old Phoebe was sold by Josiah Richardson Jr. of Sudbury to a woman in Framingham. And that property deed is not in Sudbury, but it is in the Framingham History Center. Wills, in particular, can show vast land holdings in places where the slave owner did not reside. The men who owned enslaved persons could often afford to own other kinds of property. For example, I found out that lots of people from Sudbury moved to or owned property in Worcester or Worcester County. Intermarriages between African Americans could involve different towns. Dinah of Sudbury, for example, married 2 men from Lincoln at 2 different times. The abutting towns of Framingham, Marlborough, and the praying Indian town of Natick all had close ties to Colonial Sudbury. That is why if you have reason to suspect movement, check the histories of other towns, many of which are now online. I am almost certain that a Sudbury resident sold the mother of an enslaved boy he owned to purchase land in Westboro, according to a history of Westboro. While you get more insight into the lives of enslaved persons from letters and journals, which are few in number, sadly, far more records for enslaved persons exist that show their value as property rather than their humanity. Wills are probably the most reliable indicator of enslaved persons. They are available for free with an account on American Ancestors. They're also available on Family Search, which is a free search site of the Mormon Church. For those who don't want to pay for Ancestry, they have done a marvelous job to have things available. Any person designated in a probate inventory with a value is enslaved, usually identified as Negro. Negro man named Cato, for example, worth 53 pounds, is in the inventory of Jonas Noyes's will at the Wayland Historical Society and is part of the library exhibit, a copy of that record. Vital records are available no matter the community in which you live. And the best part is all of those are now available online. Vital records can be tricky to use and can often prove more helpful after a person has been identified as an enslaved, free, or freed Black. Race is often not indicated in entries of births, marriages, and deaths, just to make it more fun, unless the record has a separate section, which some towns do and some don't, which it would be entitled Negroes. The birth record for Peter Harry in Sudbury in 1716 does not designate the race or status of either him or his parents. It is only through other research resources that his race becomes clear, but still leaves his status in question. And yes, you have to live with the fact, and this is probably the hardest thing to do, that not all questions can be answered, at least until by some miracle, additional information surfaces. So you'll follow a story and it disappears and it drives you crazy. I don't know what else to tell you. Many tax and census records can be assessed online, some on the Sudbury archives, helpful but disappointing. In many cases, these records often list the number of enslaved persons in a town within certain age parameters, but not the names of the enslaved, and often without the names of the enslavers. The 1754 slave census, for example, taken under the direction of Royal Governor William Shirley, is just what it claims to be, recording only the number of enslaved persons in towns with no names of the enslaved or their owners specified. It does at least show you the difference between the number of males and the number of females, but that's it. The well-known Massachusetts valuation list of 1771 lists only the names of the owners and the number of unnamed servants for life they owned. No names of enslaved persons were included, as they are merely of interest as for their value as property that the owners will be taxed for. And only those between 14 and 45 are counted, which provides insight into the assumed useful work life of an enslaved person. The 1765 census was shown at the first slide, pictured here, gives an unusually high number of enslaved people living in Colonial Sudbury. And that will be explained, the discrepancy between that, because usually the numbers were in the teens. This gave 27, and there are various explanations and suppositions that one can make, but I talk about that at length in what I wrote. Court records are awesome and often gruesome as well. The two I found involved young enslaved boys, one in the 1660s and the other in the early 1700s, who were horribly mistreated. No one who reads these cases can have any doubt of the evils of slavery and its dehumanization. Lots of work has been done on identifying and telling stories of overlooked patriots of color who enlisted in the Revolutionary War, including those who recorded Sudbury as their place of residence. Great work has been done by three sources. One is the American Forgotten Patriots and African American Patriots of Color, and that is the DAR website. Also the 17 volumes of the Massachusetts Soldiers and Sailors in the Revolutionary War, and in the year I think it was 2004, yes, the National Park Service published Patriots of Color that fought on the Battle Road on April 19, 1775, and at Bunker Hill in June of 1775. So, so I will tell you that the number of those who enlisted from Sudbury are very few in number. I think there were 6 in total, and most of them had ties to the praying Indian town next door of Natick. It opened a window for me on the relationships between the praying Indians and African Americans, two groups who were largely overlooked by white townspeople. Once a soldier was identified, his service record could be looked up in the 17-volume Massachusetts Soldiers and Sailors in particular. In addition, but unfortunately, all these studies give names. The Soldiers and Sailors gives their service in the Revolutionary War, and no details about their lives before or after their service, or whether or not they had been enslaved, free, or freed. So it is, you know, it's useful, but it leaves a lot of questions unanswered. And lastly, we should always bear in mind that all our information is one-sided. It is all from the perspective of white, primarily male townspeople of Colonial Sudbury. So we only hear half the story. One of my later efforts involved looking a bit beyond the date, most often associated with the end of slavery in Massachusetts, which is the 1780s. I had found several documents from the 19th century that referred to enslaved people who had lived in Colonial Sudbury and wanted to explore these new findings. Although slavery was not abolished in Massachusetts by law, several court cases brought by enslaved persons in 1783 challenged their status as a violation of the rights granted to the citizens of Massachusetts in the Constitution of 1780. There'll be a test on all these dates when you're done. They won their cases, and the first federal census of 1790 proclaimed that Massachusetts was the only state that had no slaves, but noted households that had people of color living in them. At that time, a total of 11 persons of African descent lived in Sudbury and Wayland. 9 would live on the and were taxed. The only so there were 9 on the east side, the Wayland side, and 2 on the Sudbury side. And they lived in the homes by and large of their former enslavers. So identification of Black males who had been enslaved was easier for men than for women. All male townsmen were assessed a poll or a head tax, a flat tax, irrespective of one's status or race. It is through poll tax records, which will soon be online thanks to Kay, our curator, doing it for the town, that the mystery, because a lot of people in Wayland want to know who this Peter Booz is. Because he is buried at North Cemetery, buried in North Cemetery and said to have been enslaved to Colonel John Noyes. And it is through these poll records that I think his status came to a logical conclusion. References to women were less frequent as they did not pay a poll tax, but a few made their presence and status known. But yes, it was much harder. This is a male-dominated society, no matter how you slice it. Back in colonial days, all these discoveries are contained in a book that I am seeking to publish, giving detailed accounts of the lives of the enslaved people who lived in colonial Sudbury and the masters they served. There is more to learn, but I am hoping that this book, mostly containing information which has never been published, will contribute to a deeper understanding of Wayland and Sudbury in colonial times, and to that of Massachusetts under British rule and in the early Republic. Just a personal note, it is before questions, it is very difficult to tackle this subject. It is a sensitive subject. As much as you try to look at it as a historian, it is a challenge to do that, because the history of slavery it's an abomination. And no matter how, but I as far as I could bring it, I tried to more emphasize what happened. But yes, did my personal feelings enter into it? It is very difficult to, so I don't mean it to upset people or to in any way interfere with their thoughts, but it is a part of history that was in this town and Sudbury, and it really, I really don't look at history as completed until the whole story is before me. So thank you very much, and questions, comments, whatever. Sandy.
I was wondering, is there any effort or ideas about commemorating or identifying slaves, like in Germany, they have the stumbling blocks, the homes that were confiscated and Jews that were, killed. Is there, I put myself in the place of somebody who would live in the house of formerly enslaved person, and I wouldn't really want that note on my house. And yet, I don't know. All right, is there any effort?
Yes, there is an effort. There is a program called Stepping.
Repeat the question for the people.
Okay, sorry about that. Commemoration of enslaved people in Wayland and Sudbury. And yes, there there are several now projects that are doing it. this was explored by a small group of us on the Wayland side. And I think it was, first of all, there was, I think one of the parts that you don't want this in front of your house. But the other thing is that if you could identify houses, and you can in some cases, that the program pretty much puts plaques in sidewalks. Where are Wayland sidewalks? So you would have to, I don't know if anybody else wants to say anything about it, but I think at the moment that it really has not, progressed enough to really spend much more time and effort on it at this point. As far as commemorating slavery in this town, I'm hoping to do that. And that's why I've spent over 20 years of my life researching it. This started in, in the 80s for me. I worked and I mostly studied slavery in Concord, but, then went back to it in 2017 when I retired, and I have been steadily working on it ever since. So I hope in some way that this what is published and what comes out is a commemoration and is a recognition of those people who were enslaved in this town. Yeah. Norm.
I find your process of your research fascinating. Thanks for sharing that with us. And as you speak to people around this area, do you find that there are many of the general public who are unaware that there were once slaves in Sudbury?
Sure. Yeah. I find that even in families that had enslaved people in it. So as I say, it's a sensitive subject. The foundational book of the Sudbury Plantation by Sumner Chilton Powell that won the Pulitzer Prize in history in 1964 does not talk about enslaved people or any people of color, whether that is due to the fact that there were none during that period that he talks about. But even in the 19th century, the history of Sudbury by Hudson is a 600-page book that has one page on it referring to slaves, and in a rather flattering way are they portrayed as being cared for and loved by a particular family. So I think there's a lot. Huh?
Excuse me, I was saying like around DeSantis.
So anyway, yes, I think it is a subject that people are not aware of, and I'm not totally convinced, but I would be very interested to find out how receptive people will be to finding out that all their history has not been aired. So I would say, like, I'm old enough to say that, it's time for the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey would say.
This is related to Sandy's question, but someone is asking, is there any overlay that we can see of properties back then mapped on top of Wayland roads, et cetera, as it is today?
Yes, that will be in the book. There will be a map and designating the places that enslaved people are known to have lived, and they're enslavers, by the way. So yes, there will be that in the book. So you'll know, and there are several houses that are standing that did have enslaved people in it. One of them is the Sudbury History Center, the Loring Parsonage, had enslaved people living in it. And in Wayland, there's several houses that had enslaved people living in it. Yeah.
I thought you in your presentation cited some statistics, but I kind of didn't grasp the whole thing. It sounded like you said at a certain time there were only something like 9 slaves. Is that what you said?
No, they were not slaves. The 9 were the 1790 census after slavery ended. There were 9 people of color that lived in Wayland and Sudbury.
Oh, okay. Well, but so do you have do you have any statistics on how many slaves there might have been relative to the free population in in different periods?
Yes,
to
and
get it
again,
just to give us a feeling of
Okay,
the depth of it.
So estimate in general in Massachusetts in 1700. There were estimate in New England in 1700, an estimate, I'll talk more specifically when I say this, but there were of a total population of 90,000 in New England in 1700, supposedly less than 1,000 either enslaved people or African people. So as far as Sudbury is concerned, it's a very small number. Most of the censuses, so how many have I identified? I've identified somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 or for the whole period from the mid 1600s to 1780. But that is a gross underestimate, I think, because the censuses that were taken had age parameters, and it was 16 to 45 in many cases. And therefore, anybody younger, older, did not register. And also when it came to tax purposes, there was a great incentive for owners to forget about some of their people that they have.
Yeah, well,
Explain why those ages might have been used.
Yeah, they were used because they probably were the productive life of an enslaved person, because the enslaved people in Sudbury were here for one reason only, and that was to work on a farm. So this was, so I go in great lengths in the book I wrote, sort of comparing and contrasting urban slavery, which happened in Boston, for example, where there was a much higher population of enslaved people and Black people because of the maritime industry. But here it was strictly for farming work. And therefore the need, a lot of people had big families, and it was also a matter of money. So it was expensive. You were buying somebody, and therefore the most that households had were 1 or 2 enslaved people. And of that, I would say maybe 1% of the population in the town were slave owners at a particular time.
were slave owners.
Yeah.
Only 1%. So it was
It's just-
unusual for a family to have a slave in such.
Well, it was expensive.
Well,
Number
yeah,
one
but
thing. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, no, I get that. So that suggests that if you had money,
Mhm.
then you probably had a slave, but most people didn't have money.
If you needed, so there were people like ministers that frequently had slaves across the board in New England. Because they weren't doing the farming work to the extent of somebody who did it exclusively. Tavern keepers who needed to interact with a lot of people and could always use an extra hand. So yeah, it was a question of money. I don't think that it was a question of you didn't believe in them, because everyone in town knew there were enslaved people living in that town. And there was no outcry. And again, this is much more detailed in what I wrote, but there is no outcry of the treatment. In fact, just the opposite. If you owned somebody, you were expected, it was expected that you would rule the roost, and that the people that saw something, it wasn't their business.
In your research, because it's a very specific time, which it should be, but I would think it would be so interesting, you know, when you were following someone, you finally found the name of someone, for example, an enslaved person. Was there anyone that you could keep following their generations of that enslaved person, you know, into the 1800s or anything? Or
Yeah, there's one family, I didn't go into it in detail, but probably one of the most prominent African-American families in and touched in Sudbury is a family called the Benson family. And there is probably more that one knows about the Benson family than any others. In fact, there's a book that one of the descendants of the Bensons who lived in Sudbury actually became a mariner in Salem. And there is a whole book, Charles Benson Mariner, and there is an entire book that was written about him, and it does give some background on his family. Yeah.
Is it, as you talked about the difficulties in identifying race, is it pretty certain that all the slaves in Sudbury were of African descent, no native people?
There has been no evidence that I have found, and I suspect if there were native enslaved people, but I have not found any. And I've looked hard, and that they probably were early, and that there is no documentation. So if it would fall in the span of, for example, a Puritan village that Powell wrote, there is no mention of enslavement of native people.
It seemed like the pattern after the Pequot War or King Philip's War was that they were sent to the Caribbean.
Yes. Yes, a lot of them were, but it was also, well, again, I addressed this issue in what I wrote, and basically, Indians posed a bigger problem for slave owners in this area, because first of all, they knew the land, and they, whereas you bring in an African, probably didn't even speak the language, not alone would know where to run away to. So yes, they were much more reliable, because there's a whole book, by the way, of ads for runaway slaves, and it's about that thick. And of that, there was one that ran away in Sudbury, but basically some communities would have more native people, and I think that maybe because I found out, and this is not my area of expertise, that perhaps native was more where, because that was set up as a native community. And one of the beautiful parts is that if an African slave man married an Indian free woman, your child was free. So that was a great incentive to have that, and that happened. Yeah, Pam.
After you finish the book and we all buy it, will you be contributing to the 10 million names project?
Okay, so that's wonderful.
Yeah.
So I did discuss it. Actually, Doug is here, who I discussed it with, and Rachel Robinson in Sudbury, the director in Sudbury. So their feeling, and I agree, is when the book comes out, you notify them and tell them, hey, I have a whole bunch of people that is not accounted for. So yeah.
It's a treasure project.
Hmm?
Will you explain the 10 million name project?
So this is the, why can't I think of the name? The New England, yeah, Historic Genealogical Association. They have big dreams, and their dream is that they're going to identify 10 million, sorry, enslaved people. And yes, I read the article, I belong, and yes, and we had a conversation about it as to, you know, should I notify them or what? And then it was afterwards, because then there's something concrete to tell them and show them, and a list of names that, because in addition to what I wrote, I also did a spreadsheet which I'm now renaming Timeline, that documents all the references. So that's about 20 some odd pages, and it documents all the references to enslaved people and enslavers in Colonial Sudbury.
You have a treasure there. No, really appreciate
Yeah,
that.
so,
Courtney has just put up the.
oh, thank you.
website.
When's your book coming out, Jane?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? So we're working to try to get it published, so as I say, it will be finished this weekend. And you know, we'll see where it goes from there, but anybody have any great ideas, please send them here.
A few questions online. One is, do you know if there was an active underground railroad in Colonial Sudbury? And if so, have those locations been documented?
Not underground railroad in Colonial Sudbury,
Right.
and we cannot even document on the east side. Everybody wants, and we had a wonderful, fabulous abolitionist here, Lydia Maria Child, one of my favorite people in the whole world. But one of the drawbacks to Underground Railroad in Sudbury and Wayland, I think there are thoughts of more on the Sudbury side, but I truthfully have not spent as much time studying abolition in Sudbury as I did, although I just saw a wonderful letter from Frederick Douglass when he came to visit Sudbury, and said it was the worst town he'd ever been in. So, but in Wayland, we had Lydia Maria Child, and a lot of people tried to make her as a somebody on a station master or something, and she was not. First of all, Wayland had no public transportation. It was hard to get people in and out of Wayland, whereas in Concord, they had a railroad starting in 1844. Wayland got it in 1880. So
And Newton has a.
yeah, and we spend a lot of time. We actually have a boat in New Bedford, which is just, you know, wonderful place to study the Underground Railroad. But I must admit, I have not spent as much time on, I've heard stories, but I have not spent as much time really tracking them down on the west side. I've lived on the east side for 53 years, so I plead a little ignorance, and if somebody knows the answer to that, please chime in.
So do you know what happened to the Phoebe, the baby, the 2-year-old?
I know that she was very soon after sold to a man, and so typically, when you sold a child that young, you wanted the child to be raised in the family. You didn't want children to begin with. They were just, until they were old enough to be productive laborers, they were of very little use. But it was not unusual to sell a small child sorry about this, was to sell a small child to be raised in a family that they would eventually serve. All I know about Phoebe is that she was very quickly sold to someone else, and did not stay with the widow Walsh, who was her buyer. So I have not, again, not tracked Phoebe as much as I maybe could have, but a lot of times these kids disappear and are sold again. And it's just, you'll be very surprised to read some of the incidents that involve children, enslaved children. It is truly heartbreaking and gut-wrenching to see what happens, and two court cases that are in the book involve very young children.
And the court case is trying to get them to see their mothers again?
No.
No.
No, not anywhere close to that.
So what's the court cases?
I'm not going to tell you.
So-
I'll call you Yamini because
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jane, for this informative session. My question to you is, what is that one wish, a very strong wish with this book coming out? How do you think Wayland residents can help you achieve that? How can we help?
Oh, well, okay, we should sit down and talk about that. At the moment, we're gonna try to submit it to something called the History Press, which required a 10-page application to see if they would even deign to read it. We're hoping will go in, and by that, I'm telling you, Gretchen, who representing the Wayland Historical Society, Rachel Robinson representing the Sudbury Historical Society, and hopefully that will be submitted, that application, by the end of October. And they have a very quick turnaround, whether they would accept it to read or not. And after that, if they don't, it's back to square one. And yes, we'd love to sit down and have a conversation. So,
Could I just point out that Yamini is the chair? Is that
yes,
of the Human Rights Committee, Diversity,
yes, she,
Equity, and Inclusion. And thank you.
thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. I'm sorry, I just know Yamini so long now, because I actually, yes, sir.
Yeah, you said that Reverend Israel Loring had a slave or slaves
Mhm.
for a long period of time, and his position in the town and the society he was highly regarded. So that tells me that if Israel Loring had slaves, then nobody frowned upon anybody having slaves. It was fully accepted. It was simply a matter, did you have the money to own a slave or not? There was no cultural opposition to slavery.
There was
at all.
very little, and that is, as they say, detailed, not, and so there's also detailing the church's attitude toward, and in Wayland and Sudbury, it is the Congregational Church, but other, so there was a very fine line. How do you justify slavery as a churchman? And because you don't want to use it as a means of emancipating people, so you have to, how do you justify that it was good? And yes, there's a whole long message in the book that has to do with that topic.
So there was kickback on the moral grounds from some of the churches.
I have not, no, Quakers,
Quakers.
but at this time, no. There's a wonderful book. Another wonderful book is a book by Richard Bowles, and it's called Dividing the Faith, and it talks about African Americans. It's and the church. It specifically details and deals with the church and the issue of slavery and attitudes towards African Americans in the church.
So then would you say that it wasn't until the 19th century that the general culture turned away from slavery, and that's when the abolition movement began? But after Israel Loring was long dead, and after there had been a long history, it finally, the culture turned against it.
Not all the culture. turned against
Well, I
it.
mean, we did have a civil
Only a
war
minority.
eventually, and there was the
Only a minority.
There
Emancipation
were
Proclamation.
pockets, you have somebody like Samuel Sewall going back to 1700 and, you know, the selling of Joseph. So there were little people, but the abolitionist movement did not start and it started, I think, in Philadelphia first, around the time of the revolution. So the revolution was a great catalyst for ideas about freedom, natural rights, slavery. So as far as I know, the first abolitionist movement was in Philadelphia about 1775, 1776. Really, the revolution was the great catalyst to
The
this.
Declaration of Independence really jump-started. It was the Kickstarter for.
Well, I mean,
abolition.
it sort of set the tone, yes. Sandy.
I was wondering, where did people in our area get their slaves? Did they go to the slave auction in Boston?
So that's a wonderful question. A lot of the auctions were in Boston, or somebody I read that somebody transported, or you wanted to sell a slave and you had a relative in another town and you brought it, you know, in so various means. I don't know. There weren't slave auctions the way you're thinking of them in the South. There were places you could buy, say, slaves, or they would advertise some, but there wasn't a slave auction per se. It was either in a tavern or something like that, or some building, a merchant building. So it's not the South.
Oh, I thought
Talk
there
about
was
the
something at
New England
Faneuil Hall.
captains who
I thought
brought
there
them.
was something.
Yeah, I mean, they came basically through the trade. You know, I mean, Boston was a fabulous maritime trading place, and the slave trade was part of it. That was the bread and butter. That was what made money. But most of the slaves that New England merchants were involved in did not come to Massachusetts. They went to the South, they went to the West Indies. So typically, probably the second tier or the third tier of slaves, maybe not fit for the rigors of the South for whatever reason, came to New England, or they were a specific order. So-and-so wanted an enslaved person, and so a captain would bring one to that person. Again, I explain all of this, the method that was used to bring, but as the population in New England is very small, the need for enslaved people, it's not a year-round thing because most of the people that were here, it was all the people here were farmers. The enslaved people here were needed for labor on farms, and in the winter they were a burden. So yeah, so you know, you had to feed them, you had to clothe them, they lived in your house. And so therefore, you had to have a circumstance in which it was going to help you and help what you needed done. But as they say, and children were again, not anything that anybody wanted because they're not productive. A whole different mindset than, you know, you really have to skew your mind in a very unpleasant way to wrap yourself around the attitudes that were so different than today. Hopefully they were so different.
The important thing is that it was here, and New Englanders don't like to think that we were like that.
Right.
So that's important to know.
And yeah, and a lot of people don't even think. I mean, as I say, my moment came when I realized that some of these men fighting at the North Ridge in Concord were slave owners. How could that possibly, and they're railing against, you know, slavery and the British are trying to enslave us and they're doing this to us and we want our freedom and we have the right to govern ourselves. And here in their midst are people that they are holding in bondage. It is just hard to really wrap your head around it. It's so foreign, not just maybe for this time, but it's also foreign to a lot of people who no longer feel like that way.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Jane, I see and hear so many people are so hungry for the knowledge that you have and for other knowledge. And it was brought up about the stepping stones and so forth. And you certainly tried to pull a group together.
I did.
And the last time that we met, even though invitations went out, it was only the Historical Society group that showed up. But I think many of you now realize that there's a need, and I'm hoping that some of you will contact Jane and step up and we can.
I have to give credit to Mary Ann Burkowski because she also was a very devoted.
Right, but come up and step up so that we can actually achieve your goal of recognizing them as human beings and putting their names out there in some form. So I throw that out to the audience and to the Zoom audience as well.
Thank you.
Do you have more questions, Courtney?
These are sort of specific about certain
Well, I
characters and
may not
such.
answer it.
So I'll try one and then
Okay.
so the one is asking about Simeon, Israel Loring's enslaved person. Do you know if he had a last name?
Oh, there's many pages.
Okay.
Deal with that subject.
All right, read the book.
I'll tell you one thing. I'll answer it sort of. He did not have a last name in Israel Loring's journals.
Okay. Thank you.
I'll tantalize people with that little tidbit.
So this is just a comment. I'm a therapist and I'm now haunted by Phoebe, the trauma of being taken from.
Well, if you
and then again, the other family was probably cruel to.
if you read several of the court cases, you will think that Phoebe didn't have it as bad as one particular case. It is just horrific. It is horrific.
Is it true that most of the information about children only comes through a sale? I mean, they're not documented in any other way unless they're sold or.
Yeah, they're also documented in wills.
Okay, fine, thank you.
Mhm.
All right.
So specifically, people have accounted for slaves in a will.
Children.
Yeah, yeah. And what is to become of them.
Mhm.
Yeah. I don't know.
Thank you.
Thank you.
On behalf of the library, the Historical Society, and the Human Rights Committee, thank you so much for joining us. We do have some refreshments for those of you who are here. Sorry about the Zoomers. You'll have to get your own refreshment. But please stop on your way out and help yourself. And thanks so much for coming. Thanks.